listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. Sasha Barbagat with you. If you had to pick one party to lead the country, which one would it be? Well, if we look to the latest polls for guidance, around 1 in 5 of us would say One Nation.
It means we're talking about them, we're talking about issues that don't help Labor. And, I think Albanese is genuine when he says it's a worry, not just for the state of democracy, but for the state of Labor.
A deep dive into the rise of One Nation and whether or not Pauline Hanson could actually become our next Prime Minister is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spyrou on Tuesday, the 20th of January.
Hey Sash, Labor's contentious hate speech and gun reforms are set to pass Parliament today after striking deals with the Liberals and the Greens to get them through. The latest breakthrough in negotiations came late yesterday after a meeting between Anthony Albanese and opposition leader Susan Lee, during which they agreed to cut a deal. It's understood the Prime Minister has agreed to include a provision in the hate speech laws that would see a review of how the legislation has been working 2 years after being passed.
Yeah, and the coalition is also pushing for it to be mandatory for the government to consult with the opposition on which hate groups are listed and delisted. So that's talking about groups like the National Socialist Network and Hizb ut-Tahrir. Not all MPs are on board with this bill, though, across both sides of Parliament. Some in Labor aren't happy Albanese has dropped a measure in the bill that'd create a new racial vilification offence, which is aimed at targeting hate preachers. And he did that in order to get Coalition and Greens support, while a number of Coalition MPs remain concerned about the discretion that will be given to ministers to designate and outlaw hate groups.
So with amendments, this new set of laws will do a few things, but mainly it will tighten visa rules, increase penalties for existing hate crime offences and ban groups that spread racial hatred. Meantime, the second Bondi bill, one that will enact a national gun buyback scheme, will also be voted on in Parliament today and will likely pass. The Greens have agreed to support it, which will set into motion the country's biggest firearm buyback since the 1996 Port Arthur massacre.
Yeah, the only issue with the gun buyback, Chris, is that the federal government in enacting this legislation is going to ask the states and territories to foot half the bill. So they're saying, yep, we're going to go 50-50 on funding this gun buyback, but we're also going to need the states to run it, essentially. So we know that the Labor states have agreed and the territories and the ACT. However, Queensland and the Northern Territory have flagged they will not be footing half the bill. So it'll be interesting to see then what happens as we kind of move forward with this gun buyback scheme, whether the government's going to have to change up how it approaches it or whether the Northern Territory and Queensland are just not going to have a gun buyback scheme. We'll have to wait and see.
Beaches in Sydney have been closed after an unprecedented 3 shark attacks in 24 hours. The latest happened last night when a man was bitten while in the water at Manly Beach.
Tourniquet him, we're talking to him and we're all just trying to keep him awake and keep him alive, just do what we could for him.
That audio thanks to Seven. The surfer's been rushed to hospital with leg injuries and is currently in a critical condition. Earlier at DY Beach, which is a little over 5 k's north of Manly, an 11-year-old surfer was lucky to escape uninjured when a shark bit his board.
In response to those 2 incidents, 20 beaches in Sydney's north have been closed to swimmers today, while investigations are underway to try to identify the type of sharks involved. Now, this all comes after a 12-year-old boy was critically injured while swimming at a harbour beach on Sunday afternoon. He's had surgery and remains in hospital in a critical condition.
Yeah, so we did mention that this is unprecedented. And so the question is, have these people just been incredibly unlucky, or is there a reason behind this sharp increase in shark encounters? Well, Sydney has copped a lot of rain over the last 72 hours, and experts say that creates conditions that are really friendly to sharks who will follow bait fish that are lured in by extra bacteria to feed on. So that's this whole scientific process that kind of does explain what's going down.
Yeah, well, experts are saying that could be forming part of why we are seeing this. Now, all this rain in Sydney has also made waters quite murky, and that's making the sharks difficult to spot with drones, which is part of monitoring programs. And if you combine that with the big swells that have disabled smart drumline monitoring, keeping an eye out for the animals in the water has been almost impossible the last few days. So there's a few factors at play here, Chris. Another one was that the young boy at Vaucluse, the harbour beach on Sunday afternoon, they were jumping off rock platforms into the water. And so the murky conditions, being lured in by those extra bait fish, and then, the splashes and the sound that these kids were creating when they were jumping into the water kind of created the perfect storm. So we don't know, but it's, unprecedented, as you said, to see 3 shark attacks in Sydney in 24 hours.
To Queensland now, where police say they've been left traumatised after a 19-year-old Canadian woman's body was found washed up on a popular tourist island, surrounded by a pack of dingoes. Despite confirming her body had been touched and interfered with by the wild animals on Gari, formerly known as Fraser Island, authorities say they're still working out her cause of death.
We simply can't confirm whether this young lady drowned or died as a result of being attacked by dingoes.
That's Police Inspector Paul Algie speaking there.
It's understood the young woman had been living and working at a backpackers hostel on the island for the last 6 weeks and had left at around 5 a.m. on Monday morning for a swim. Her body was found washed up north of Gari's historic Maheno shipwreck about an hour later.
2 male persons had been driving south from up near Orchard Beach and seen a large pack of dingoes, approximately 10 dingoes, near an object, and upon closer inspection, saw that it was in fact a female person.
Police officers and paramedics arrived at the scene soon after and found her unresponsive, saying they were working to get in contact with her family in Canada and had already informed her friend she was travelling with, who police say had been left extremely traumatised. Inspector Algie also telling media police were left traumatised and that the incident would have widespread impacts on the entire community, but also issued a warning not to be interacting with dingoes at the moment. This island, dingoes are wild animals. They are known to be on this island. And while they are very culturally significant, authorities are saying that we need to be treating them as wild animals and to keep our distance. So while police and, they're working with local authorities there to figure out and piece together what went down, rangers are going tent by tent and just letting people know, hey, this is what's gone down. Just have your wits about you.
Heading overseas now, where Donald Trump has declined to rule out seizing Greenland by force and insists he will push ahead with slapping 8 European countries with more tariffs if a deal is not reached over the Danish-controlled territory. In a brief phone interview with NBC News, the US president also repeated his frustrations with Norway. And this is after the country published a text he sent its prime minister in which he said he no longer feels an obligation to think purely of peace, since the country didn't give him the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, a reminder, it is the Norwegian Nobel Committee which selects the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize each year and has done so since 1901.
Yeah, and that's a fact that, the Prime Minister of Norway tried to remind Trump of in these text exchanges, but Trump is adamant that, Norway and the Norwegian government is in full control of who wins the Nobel Peace Prize, saying, quote, they like to say they have nothing to do with it, but they have everything to do with it. In that interview, he also took aim at European leaders who have condemned his commentary around Greenland and, these threats of taking it by force or taking it by other means. He said that they should be instead focused on the war with Russia and Ukraine and not Greenland. Now, as to European leaders who have called this out, we know of most of them. France's Emmanuel Macron has called him out. He's pretty much said that Europe should be considering, they call them these bazooka measures. It's like these bazooka tariff measures. So if a country ever threatens Europe or its allies with economic sanctions, they use this as a countermeasure. Italy's Giorgia Meloni is pretty much saying, oh, guys, we're misunderstanding Trump here. There's no need to take such dire action. But we also did hear from Keir Starmer, who towed the line and had this to say this morning.
The use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. It is not the right way to resolve differences within an alliance. Nor is it helpful to frame efforts to strengthen Greenland's security as a justification for economic pressure.
So, his position there is quite clear, and he does echo a lot of what these other European leaders are saying. But, critics are saying he could have gone a little bit harder and called out Donald Trump for all of this. Look, we do know talks are going to be happening this week. We know that Donald Trump is going to be in Switzerland for the World Economic Forum, as are a bunch of other European leaders where it's expected they'll be having a lot of talks and, probably talking about Greenland too.
And back home, a number of Aussies have advanced through to second round action at the Australian Open after a successful day on the court. Alex de Minaur, Ayla Tomljanovic, Jordan Thompson, Priscilla Horn and Storm Hunter all winning their round one clashes yesterday. Sadly, though, we saw local hope Alexei Popyrin knocked out after a 5-set thriller against Frenchman Alexander Muller.
Yes, and Novak Djokovic made history again, this time for recording his 100th win at his 21st Aus Open.
I mean, what can I say? I like the sound of it. You know, Centurion is pretty nice. Nice feeling to be a Centurion also in these numbers. And, you know, I always give my best whenever I'm on the court. Obviously, history making is a great motivation, and particularly in the last, 5-10 years of my career.
That audio thanks tonight. And listen to that, Sash, Novak Djokovic and Chris Spyrou, two people who love big numbers. Now, look, it's a feat he also achieved at Wimbledon and Roland Garros. If he can take out this year's tournament, it'll mark his 25th major to make him the most decorated tennis player of all time, which is epic.
Isn't he tired?
Yeah.
Just look at his record. I'm like, dude, just go lie down with your millions and millions and millions of dollars.
But isn't it nuts that he can still do it?
Yes.
Like, and still win it at his age?
Yeah, it's interesting with tennis. It's one of those sports that you can have quite a lot of longevity. Looking at some of the younger players, they're in their teens and, Djokovic is
38.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that's a really long shelf life. Look, in order to achieve that feat of a 25th major, Djokovic would have to try to overcome the likes of Jannik Sinner, who is in round 1 action today. Day 3 will also see Naomi Osaka, Stefanos Tsitsipas.
My man.
And Madison Keys take to the court, along with a few Aussies, including 30th seed Maya Joint. She's one of the younger ones I mentioned. She's 19. She's one of the new Aussies on the scene, and there's quite a lot of hype around her. So go Maya.
Go Maya indeed. Now, look, that is it for our headlines for today. Coming up next is my deep dive. Whether or not our next Prime Minister could in fact be Pauline Hanson. She thinks she's up for the top job. Let's see if she can logistically get it done. Stick around, that deep dive's coming up for you next. She's been referred to by her supporters as our country's first ever political prisoner, has been in public life for more than 3 decades, and has warned us that Australia was in danger of being swamped by Asians and has in fact been swamped by Muslims. If you haven't clocked it yet, I'm talking about Pauline Hanson, and her party, Pauline Hanson's One Nation, has this week overtaken the coalition as the second most preferred political party in a major poll for the very first time. And she says she's ready to form government.
At this stage, look, these are only polls. I've really got a job ahead of me now. I really have. By putting us at 22% of the national poll at the moment, that says I've got a hell of a job ahead of me with my other colleagues. And we've got to maintain that support and confidence from the Australian people that we can hopefully form government, and too right, I want to do it.
One Nation's primary vote, according to a news poll conducted for The Australian, has risen by 7 points over the last 2 months, hitting 22%, and has recorded a similar rise in another poll for 9 papers on 18%. And it's a stark contrast from this time last year when her party was polling between 3 and 7%. Something the Prime Minister has described as a worry.
They're a pretty divisive lot, and I think it's a worry. I'm a believer in mainstream politics and that the parties of government, it's important. It served this country pretty well.
So how exactly did we get here? And could Pauline Hanson actually become the next Prime Minister of Australia? Dr Jill Sheppard is a political scientist from the Australian National University, and she joins me now. Jill, welcome back to the briefing. Now, we're told to exercise caution when it comes to polling in general, but how seriously should we be taking these latest results when it comes to Pauline Hanson?
Well, a couple of things are happening, right? One is that there's a big trend towards One Nation and away from the coalition, importantly, and also away from Labor in the Resolve poll that came out over the weekend. The other is that this is every poll. This is not one outlier. This is every pollster with different samples of different Australians finding the same thing. Now, some of that might be down to what's called poll herding, where if you're a pollster, you get this result and you think, oh, this is a bit wacky. You know, I don't know if this fits in with everyone else. So what you do is some adjustments to the data that sounds a bit dodgy, but it happens all the time, to make it more reflective of what you think the actual sort of underlying number in the population is. And what happens is that no pollster wants to be the odd one out. So they herd on a particular point. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think there is a genuine underlying shift away from the coalition towards One Nation. And that's happening for a couple of reasons that we can chat about. But it does feel real, and it's a real wake-up call for the coalition.
I do want to talk about some of the reasons. I mean, the big one that's swirling around, at least this week, is this is a post-Bondi thing. In your opinion, does that form part of the picture, and how much of the picture do you think that forms?
A tiny part. I think this has been happening for decades. So what we're seeing happening over the sort of long term is this detachment from the major parties, where you don't feel like at 18 you kind of mature into being a Liberal voter or a Labor voter, and that you vote the same way that your parents did. You are much more open both to swapping parties from your parents and also just to not really, putting your flag down with any particular party. We're hedging our bets. We're moving between parties. We don't feel socially connected to any of the major parties really anymore. And that means that we're open to move. And what's happened with One Nation is that there are all these voters who should probably ideologically sit with the coalition, either Liberal or National, but they're not liking what they're seeing from the coalition at the moment. Some of that's about competence, whether we think these are people who can run a competent and effective government. Some of it is about confusion around the messaging. Say on free speech laws and hate speech, the Liberal Party can't really get their act together. They don't really know what they stand for. And the Liberal Party traditionally should have been a party that was pro-free speech, and they tie themselves in knots at the moment trying to argue against that. One Nation, on the other hand, is a very minor party. They don't have any members in the House of Representatives in Australia. That frees them up to have a much clearer ideological position. They can just say we are for free speech or we're not, because we don't really have any members that we have to, negotiate with internally. That makes them very appealing for people who are looking for an ideological home. The other thing is that, as I say, there aren't people who just see themselves as Liberals anymore. It's become a bit embarrassing, I think, for a lot of voters to describe themselves as Liberal in a way that One Nation, bizarrely, if for those of us who remember 1996 or 1998, doesn't seem to be anymore. That stigma around being One Nation is not gone entirely, but it's certainly a lot lower.
What role do you think, Barnaby Joyce joining One Nation has to do with all of this? Do you think there's a Barnaby factor to all of this?
I think we've got a bit of a chicken and egg question here. And one is that would Barnaby have left the Nationals for One Nation if they weren't already, on the ascendancy? The second is that it obviously helps to mainstream One Nation. I think what's really interesting is seeing how low-key Pauline Hanson has been over the last couple of years. Now, to a sort of casual observer of politics, that might sound like a bizarre thing to say, because you only see her when she pops up wearing a hijab in Parliament. But compared to how active and how provocative she used to be, she's a lot more low-key these days. And that means that there are voters coming into the electorate, whether they are migrants or whether they are newly turned 18, who haven't seen the worst of Pauline Hanson from a policy and ideological perspective and quite like what they see. The One Nation's popularity seems to be almost completely inversely related to how prominent Pauline is. Now, what happens with Barnaby then? Does he step into the role of sort of prominent provocateur, or does he likewise keep a quite low profile? I don't think it's in Barnaby's DNA to keep a low profile. And that's going to present challenges, I think, more than benefits for One Nation, because at the moment they're flying under the radar, and that's helping them a lot.
She's someone that goes a lot further than the coalition in a lot of areas when it comes to things like immigration. Do you think it's possible that there are just more Australians who simply want her style of politics and want her views represented in Australian Parliament?
The question of immigration is really interesting, because One Nation's position to heavily limit migration is probably closer to the median Australian than is Labor's or Liberals' position. And one reason for that is that Liberal Party and Labor are very close with business. They get money from big business, they deal with them daily, and business tends to be very pro-migration. Now, for a lot of Australians, they would think that's, being pro-migration is sort of the better outcome here. But also Australians would say, well, I don't really like parties relying on business so much for money and having all of these sort of captured interests. So I think getting that diversity of views, not just from voters, but from people with vested interests in the wealth of the country, is really important. And it's something that One Nation doesn't really have to engage with at the moment. As they become bigger, they will have this problem where they need more money. Pauline Hanson is already very close with Gina Rinehart. Now, Gina Rinehart's view on migration doesn't necessarily need to align with Pauline Hanson's, but if their interests become at loggerheads, then that's going to be a really important sort of line in the sand for One Nation and something that they're going to have to deal with internally. I don't know how well their internal structures are set up to deal with internal disagreement, because up until now it's been Pauline's way or the highway, and there's plenty of former One Nation members, who've been cast aside because they disagree with their leader. But as you get bigger, these are all of the kinds of things that you have to factor in. And it's where Liberal Party runs on the board. They've got, muscle memory. They know how to do this. They know how to run a government. And One Nation simply doesn't.
You mentioned there Pauline as a leader. There are, corners of the internet at the moment calling for Pauline to become our next Prime Minister. We're seeing that being thrown around more and more, especially in the wake of Bondi. But can she actually do that?
She could. Constitutionally, she could. She would have 3 months from going to the Senate to becoming Prime Minister, in which to move to the House of Representatives and become a Prime Minister in the sort of way that we're used to, sitting in the lower house. What would happen, though, is that, say in the case of John Gorton, who replaced Harold Holt in the 60s, he moved from the Senate to the lower house because one of his Liberal Party colleagues stepped aside to make way for him, and that caused a by-election in the lower house, and John Gorton was elected and then was made a constitutionally proper Prime Minister. Pauline Hanson has no One Nation members in the House of Representatives, so politically there's no way that would happen unless she could find someone from the Liberal Party to stand down, cause a by-election. Pauline Hanson runs in the House of Representatives, she wins, and then she somehow gets the support of the majority of the House of Representatives. I don't know how she would do that. That is mathematically impossible at the moment, unless she could win over a whole bunch of disaffected Labor members. But I don't think that's going to happen. So the very short answer to that technical explanation is that no, she's not going to become Prime Minister anytime soon.
Yeah, and look, in the highly unlikely event that she manages to garner some support, where do you think that's going to come from?
So Pauline Hanson tends to get support mostly from disaffected coalition voters, but also from some Labor voters who feel like they've been left behind by Labor's increasingly kind of pro-globalisation, pro-progressive social policy type outlook. That's not a huge electorate anymore, because a lot of those voters have previously shifted to the coalition anyway. So they've sort of ended up potentially from Labor to One Nation, but via the coalition. So we're not going to see massive shifts away from Labor. But what was interesting about the election in May last year was that the coalition was willing to do a preference deal with One Nation, which they had never done before. They'd done it once, I think, at West Australia in 2017 state election. But this normalisation of dealing with One Nation is going to help them become more mainstream. And it's going to signal to a lot of disaffected coalition voters that these aren't the bad guys. These are technically our sort of electoral enemies, but that they're not forbidden. They're not like sort of dangerous. They're closer to us than they are far apart. And that's been a huge shift in the normalisation of One Nation. But again, it's also just a lot of new voters coming into the electorate who aren't aware of the stigma that John Howard in particular was able to sort of rally around Pauline Hanson.
Before we let you go, Jill, I do want to ask you, the Prime Minister on Monday labelled, One Nation's climb in the polls as a, quote, worry. This feels like a pretty strong change in language for him when it comes to Pauline Hanson. Why do you think we're hearing that shift in language from the Prime Minister there?
Well, it is starting to bite at Labor as well. They've polled quite badly over the weekend. It makes Labor's job a little bit harder because they're already dealing with the Greens on the left flank, the coalition only slightly to the right of them, and now not just One Nation, but One Nation supporters a long way out to the right. It shifts the kinds of things that Labor wants to talk about. They don't really want to be talking about migration. They don't really want to be talking about hate speech. These aren't things that Labor feels comfortable campaigning on. And the rise of One Nation, even if it's only in polling terms, and if they never turn this into votes, it means we're talking about them. We're talking about issues that don't help Labor. And, I think Albanese is genuine when he says it's a worry, not just for the state of democracy, but for the state of Labor.
Jill, thanks for joining us again on The Briefing.
It's always a pleasure, Chris.
That was political scientist from ANU, Dr Jill Sheppard, speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. If you enjoyed this chat or you got something out of it, why not flick it over to a mate? And while you're there, leave us a rate and a review. I'm Chris Spyrou. I'll catch you next time.